Here we go. Maybe people will straggle in. Okay, so Freddie, a weird question for you. Think back to high school. You're about to graduate, and a few people who know you the best are writing down predictions for the course of your life, your personal life, your work life, your interests, and so on. What now, looking back on that hypothetical exercise, would they be least surprised by, and what would they be most surprised by?
I think they would be least surprised by the fact that I ended up getting a PhD and working at an academic institution for a few years and publishing a few papers, etc. I would have been surprised by that, but they would not have been surprised. Everybody has been telling me that I would end up in a PhD program my whole life up until I actually did, and I always said that I didn't want to be an academic. I grew up in academia and have a kind of always had a kind of jaundiced view of the academy. And my father was a professor, and his father was a professor, and his father was a professor. And so I did not particularly want to continue that tradition, and I haven't. But everybody always told me that I was bound to be somehow sort of academically inclined. So that would be the sort of least surprising thing for them. As far as the most surprising thing goes, I don't know that anyone would expect me to be the kind of person to do this sort of activity, right? I have made somewhere on the order of 70 podcast appearances at this point in my life, and so I'm sort of public facing. I write for a lot of publications, and I'm sort of public facing, and I don't know that people would have predicted that of me based on who I was in high school. I mean, I was pretty popular and I was social, but I was also known to be very quiet and bookish, So I don't know that they would have predicted that I would be the kind of person to go on a show like this and, share my stupid opinions.
Okay. Anything else that would have surprised them about how things turned out?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I suppose there's a lot of different elements of my biography that I certainly wouldn't have predicted. But I have kind of had to adopt a ethos of just wherever I end up is the right place for me to be at that moment. I mean, look, like I'm sure that they wouldn't have suspected that I had lived, at this point in my life at 40 years old in Washington, D.C., Brooklyn, Chicago, Honolulu, Indianapolis, and Lafayette, Indiana, Northern Virginia, as well as D.C., Boston. I mean, I never intended, Rhode Island, though not Providence. I never intended to blow around like that. It just kind of happened.
Okay, well, someday maybe we'll ask the story of the chronology of how you wandered to these places. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to hear your views on were sort of mental health in terms of policy and culture, because you've got some strong views, and that was before the recent Jordan Neely death, which kind of, you wrote eloquently about that. So, what are you want to just tell us your views? I'm familiar with some of them on sort of where the culture is on mental illness these days, and what do you think needs to be changed about that?
I mean, I think that the first thing that has to happen is that people have to understand that the average American is basing their notion of what the American mental health system is, and particularly the laws that govern involuntary treatment. They're basing that on countercultural texts from the 60s and 70s, when the policy environment is entirely different. I would also say that obviously I don't have a personal experience of institutions in the 60s and 70s, but I think they're also working on a sort of pre-modern set of assumptions about what it's like to be in an institution and what the quality of those institutions are. You talk to people, and they think that every psychiatric hospital is a horror show of, people put into straitjackets and locked in padded rooms for 12 hours a day, which is not the case. But even more importantly, there's a widespread understanding that it's too easy for people to get pulled into the system and not be able to get let out, when really the exact opposite is the case. So there's a series of events that happened that dramatically restricted the government's ability to compel people to get into treatment. The first big one is deinstitutionalization. So, I mean, deinstitutionalization might be my pick for the most consequential change, sort of American policy change of the second half of the 20th century that nobody knows about. The average American has no idea that this happened. But in 1963, the last major bit of legislation that JFK ever signed was this Community Mental Health Act, which was widely believed to be inspired by the experience of his sister, who had cognitive and developmental disabilities as a child and was given a lobotomy, and to believe that that helped sort of push JFK in this direction. But that act was designed to close the institutions. It was designed to shutter large state-run mental health facilities and replace them with community health centers, community mental health centers, to sort of move from a sort of inpatient dominant and very often compulsory treatment dominant sort of paradigm to an outpatient or a sort of mixed, you might say, paradigm. Well, the institutions got closed. Deinstitutionalization succeeded in closing dozens and dozens of state hospitals. So, I mean, this is like just a basic bare historical fact that people just seem not to understand. Dozens and dozens of American psychiatric hospitals, state-run, state-funded, were closed from the 1963 until the mid-80s, and were not replaced with new state-run facilities. They were supposed to be replaced with these community mental health centers. Unfortunately, there were two major holes in the bill. The first is that it only apportioned something like $145 or $135 million for the creation of these community mental health centers across the country. And even in 1963 dollars, that sum is just not nearly enough to actually fund these things. But it also created one of these situations, which is always the most dangerous in government, which is the federal government created this expectation that the states were going to do this, but there was no regulatory mechanism to ensure that they did do it, right? In other words, it was just, well, the states will take these grants and they will start these community mental health centers, and they didn't. The amount of I mean, you see various numbers thrown around. I don't know what to trust historically, but you often hear people say that something like 5 to 10% as many community mental health centers were opened as was actually envisioned by the people who drafted the bill. And so you can think about sort of immediately, you've closed all of these hospitals that have had long-term residents, and you have not replaced those with community mental health centers. Where did those people go? Those that could went home and had to be cared for by a family, but many of them ended up on the streets, and many of them went into the prison system. And while I wouldn't sort of assert a sort of simplistic causation here, it is the case that just as tons of patients were pushed out onto the streets out of closing institutions, we saw this rise in America's incarcerated population. So that's one big thing. That's one big sort of start. Another dimension of this is Medicaid. Now, the birth of Medicaid was a very good thing. Obviously, I think it's an essential program that has a lot of benefits, and I'm a supporter of it. But Medicaid had this quirk where it created the basis through which states could shift for the most vulnerable populations, like long-term psychiatric patients, states could shift the cost burden off of themselves onto the federal government. And in general, the story of American mental health care over the last 40, 50 years is a story of states trying to get out from under the cost burden of caring for these people. And so when Medicaid happened, again, more state facilities closed, and patients were pushed into private facilities that were able to take Medicaid dollars. And this resulted in a lot of things, but the most obvious of them being that these private facilities often had incentive to shorten periods of treatment and shuffle new patients in the door. They often had the incentive to undertreat and to underfund the facilities. And the part of the bitter irony of all this is that there's no inherent or intrinsic reason why a private institution, mental health institution that's being funded by Medicaid is going to be any more humane than the old state institutions. Another big thing is in 1975, O'Donnell v. Campbell is a Supreme Court case that establishes the legal precedent that people can only be involuntarily treated for a mental illness if they present an immediate physical threat to themselves or to others. So, in other words, it changed the old standard whereby illness itself, which continues to be the standard in, for example, the United Kingdom, where illness itself, if someone was impaired enough, then the state was empowered to provide involuntary care to them. Now the burden shifted so that it could only be given if the person was an immediate physical danger to themselves or to the people around them. That is interpreted differently from state to state. There's a lot of different systems in place that sort of how this plays out, who is making the judgments, how long you'll be in before you see a judge if you want to get out, etc. But that's the general standard. And that standard, unfortunately, has, number one, again, pushed a lot of people out of the institutions and onto the streets and into the jail system. But it also creates all manner of perverse incentives within the mental health system. So, for example, if you are someone going to the average emergency room and you want to get immediate mental health care, but you are not yet to the point where you are at risk of killing yourself or someone else, it is very common to receive essentially no help, to be treated as someone who doesn't matter, to be given a set of papers that are referrals that you can go take to an outpatient clinic if you can find one, if you have the insurance, if they don't have a waiting list, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, it bifurcated treatment in such a way that if you're an emergency room psychiatrist, your incentive for reasons of legal liability, if nothing else, was to say this person is either immediately at risk of killing themselves or somebody else, in which case we involuntarily commit them and send them off to a psychiatric institution, typically a private one, then they were no longer my problem. Or if they don't meet that standard, the outpatient treatment is what you need. And what that ends up doing is that tons and tons of people shuffle into and out of the emergency room without getting anything like appropriate psychiatric care. And it was to my mind, extremely predictable outcome of the O'Donnell v. Campbell standard. And so, and also finally, you have the American with Disabilities Act, which I think is 1990, or maybe 1991. And that, again, increases the patient's right to avoid involuntary treatment. It introduces new rules about the length of involuntary stays. And so what you have ultimately is a system where the ability of people to be forced into treatment has in fact been severely curtailed. And it's even harder to keep people in treatment after you've pulled them in than it is to get them in the first place. And the problem is no one knows that's true, right? The average person, the average American, continues to operate out of a mindset that they got by watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975 or whenever it came out.
Yeah.
And they have not updated their vision of what our system is. My perspective is just generically, it needs to be easier to pull people into care because mental illness prevents people from having the kind of faculties necessary to make informed decisions, right? And so the mental illness is already treading on their autonomy and freedom. And if you want to know the specific dimension of that, return to the old pre-O'Donnell v. Campbell standard, the standard that is still the law in the UK, and make extreme illness the definition of when you can pull someone into the system.
Can I ask a question about scale? If you were to add up all the people who are currently in institutions, currently in prison, but probably more logically belong in institutions, all of the homeless people who belong in institutions, and maybe any others, what does that look like? I mean, compared to the 1960s, is that as a proportion of the population much bigger than maybe it was back then?
It's typically, well, yeah. So there is a lot of disagreement and controversy about the exact numbers. You will frequently see claims that the total population of people with psychotic disorders, which generally speaking, we're talking about schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and bipolar disorder, is something like 1.5% of the population. Do you know
what the highest percentage of people we had in psychiatric institutions in the 1960s was ever?
I
Was it
don't
ever
know.
near that? My guess is it wasn't.
No, I mean, nowhere near that many have been in inpatient care somewhere. That's for sure. The question of sort of scale and of cost burden. One of the things that is very well established in the literature is that if you have someone who is in the jail system now, in the prison system right now, and fundamentally their problem is that they have a psychotic disorder, and there are very many people in the prison system who are not there, who have schizophrenia or have schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, and are not there for serious violent crimes, but who are there often because of they have had a series of minor crimes that have eventually resulted in a prosecution and a higher level charge. And because they are uniquely unable to be compliant with things like probation or drug testing, et cetera, they will often fail the conditions of lower level charges and get sort of escalated up the chain, despite the fact that they haven't committed a violent crime. Anyway, it is much more expensive to treat that person in the prison system than it is to treat them in an appropriate psychiatric facility. So there's also the cost of dealing with homelessness in urban centers, dealing with mental health issues through sort of ad hoc services that we're trying to sort of deliver on the street. And so even if I don't think that the population has increased. I don't think that it's that you can the total number of people who are diagnosed with mental illnesses has climbed dramatically in the last quarter century, but psychotic disorders have not climbed dramatically. But I think ultimately, if we were treating people in the right place, there are cost savings to be had rather than costs.
The claim that some people would make is, look, if you asked a homeless person, like, do you even want to live in a shelter? It's no, I want to be out, I want to be here out on the street. That you really would be institutionalizing them against their will. And what would you say to that? And
Yeah. So I mean, the question is, when we say their will, whose will are we talking about? Right. In other words, if you say if you say, okay, something is going to happen to me against my will, right? It presumes that like I am in control of, my faculties to the degree that I can understand my own will, I can represent my own will, I can take actions to try to pursue my own will. But the problem with psychotic disorders is that they hijack the mind, right? So people with schizophrenia, for example, the chronic cases and the severe cases are people who are operating under delusions, things that they strongly believe that are not true, simply are not true. Schizophrenia is often described as being a sort of our natural threat detection system as organic beings, as animals that we developed when we were wandering the plains as cavemen for 300,000 years. That schizophrenic people are often described as having that sort of natural threat detection system is miscalibrated to the point where they are perceiving threats where they are not, right? Schizophrenic people believe very deeply that they have bugs in their fillings, right? That the government is following them with organisms that move through the walls, that they are possessed by demons, etc. If you have someone in that state, if you have someone who is in a genuinely delusional state, I think the concerns for against their will kind of go out the window, because we don't know what their will is when their mind is being hijacked by some neurological deficit.
And does how is the state-of-the-art treatment progressed? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Thomas Eagleton had to withdraw his nomination for vice president because hadn't undergone shock therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I assume shock therapy isn't there much anymore. There were really strong drugs like Haldol and so on that, in some ways incapacitated people in other ways. What is the state of the art of treatment for something like schizophrenia? And how well does it work?
In the basic sense, the state of the art is not particularly more advanced than it was 50 years ago. You had part of the impetus for deinstitutionalization, part of the reason why the people who were pushing for deinstitutionalization and that bill was because of the discovery of the first generation of antipsychotics. So Haldol is one of them, haloperidol. The big one is Thorazine, which is another injectable or typically injectable antipsychotic. The problem with the first generation, well, the problem with all antipsychotics, but particularly the problem with first generation antipsychotics is they have really punishing side effect profile. So antipsychotics can cause massive weight gain. They cause tremors called akathisia, repetitive motions, things like that. One of the hallmarks of Thorazine is what's sometimes called Thorazine face, which is that it can provoke these sort of tremors in the face called tardive dyskinesia, which are very distinct. And unfortunately, those are often permanent, even if you cease treatment with the drug. There are some concerns about long-term renal failure. And these are drugs that come with a great deal of negative side effects. Second generation side effects, drugs like Seroquel, Risperdal, Geodon, Zyprexa, they also have a discouraging side effect profile, but in every element, they tend to be less intense than the first generation antipsychotics. The biggest development has been the introduction of second generation antipsychotics. We are finally starting to see some real progress in reducing the symptoms. So olanzapine is very often, olanzapine is the generic name, Zyprexa is the brand name. That's very often the psychiatrist's drug of choice because it is very effective at subduing psychotic symptoms, but it prompts just voracious appetites and often causes people to gain in excess of 50 pounds. There's a new drug, which is a version of olanzapine, which is proving to cause no weight gain. In terms of quality of life, that's immense. That's a huge benefit. The problem is there's very little money in these drugs. The pharmaceutical companies don't see the addressable population as very large. And also, that drug I just mentioned is brand new, so it's on patent. A lot of insurance companies are refusing to take it. Beyond that, it's the standard of therapy, various different kinds of talk therapy, the quality and kinds of different talk therapy vary a great deal, and everybody is pretty sure that therapy helps in general, but what kind helps for who is always controversial. Cognitive behavioral therapy has the strongest research record, but cognitive behavioral therapy is by design a short-term therapy. It is designed to always have an end date, and because psychotic disorders are almost always chronic conditions, it's not that you can't just have therapy that sort of has a built-in end date. It is now quite rare for people to get ECT. You said shock therapy, so with ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. It does still exist, and it is most often used in cases of extreme treatment-resistant depression. There's also something called transcranial stimulation, which is a less extreme version of ECT that some people have had some success with. But the point of both is to induce seizures that appear to sort of reset the brain set point. And antipsychotics and ECT sort of operate according to the same basic principle, which is that when you have a brain that is that out of whack, you need to give it a strong hit. But the essential problem is the drugs work, but they're very unpleasant to be on. And so for that reason, and because people have these underlying conditions that tell them that they're not sick, patients with psychotic disorders are extremely treatment resistant. So Jordan Neely was in and out of treatment, both voluntary and involuntary, for his entire adult life, pretty much. And it's just really, really hard to sort of get people to take their pills and take them consistently.
Okay, let me switch topics. Just very briefly, you've alluded to a forthcoming book. You want to give us a 1-minute advertisement for it?
Yeah, so my new book is coming out from Simon & Schuster on September 5th. It's called How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. The book is a history of 2020 and the echoes of the 2020 moment. So it is about the George Floyd protest movement. It's about Me Too also. It talks about the role of nonprofits in that kind of organizing. There's a chapter on the question of riots and political violence and their legitimacy and their uses. The point of the book was simply me looking back at 2020 and looking back at a truly remarkable year where there was so much noise and the whole world really did seem to start caring about this issue. There was a brief period where even majorities of Republicans were reporting that they supported the Black Lives Matter protests immediately following the George Floyd incident. And I quote some of those polling numbers. And an enormous amount of money was donated. Likely the second largest amount of donations for a charitable event since 9/11. Immense amount of corporate donations as well as personal. There was all kinds of institutional responses in ways sort of that made sense and that did not. So to pick an example, Planned Parenthood, which is an organization dedicated to the protection of abortion and other elements of women's health, put out a defund the police statement. That was the sort of the atmosphere that we were working under. All manner of labor unions and nonprofits sort of did the same. We had this big explosion of everything, and everyone insisted that this time would not be different, would be different, and things couldn't go back to normal. And from the standpoint of a few years in the future, it appears that just about nothing of substance has changed. The one attempt at a serious crack at national federal criminal justice reform, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill, failed in Congress twice, both with and without Democratic majorities. On the state and local level, there was some meaningful reform to policing in some places, but in most of those instances, they've been quietly rolled back. To me, like one of the best symbols of all of this and sort of where it went and didn't go was the fact that the Minneapolis Police Department, the city council there, in the wake of the George Floyd protests, the city council voted to dissolve the current police department and build a new one from scratch. And they passed a resolution saying they were going to do that. Later on, that was amended to just be some funding cuts and reorganization of the police department. And then later on after that, not only did they not cut anything, they in fact voted for more money for the police, right? So that's the arc that we're talking about. It struck me as just a remarkable moment in American history. And so the book is an attempt to sort of look at left social movements. So, you know, the word of the hour, of course, is woke, and people want to make this a book about woke versus anti-woke. It really has little to do with that. It's about social movements. It's about the attempts of people on the American left to create movements for change and why they don't work, why they are always seeming to run aground.
Have you read anything by Martin Gurry on this topic? The revolt of the public. I think he would broaden that to most 21st century movements, from the Tea Party to Occupy to the Arab Spring to the Indignados in Spain. That it seems to be he would say it seems to be a characteristic of the kind of online world in which these decentralized movements, protest movements, can spring up and seem very powerful, but they have no organizational infrastructure and no agenda. I don't know. What do you think of that view?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm hardly the first to make this claim, but it certainly appears that a key thing that happened is that authority, institutions, the system was perhaps a little too responsive to these protests, by which I mean the title of the book refused to the notion that these movements were co-opted from above, right? So a good example is one of the things I talk about in the book. You had this explosion in hiring of positions specifically earmarked for people of color and in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in these sort of racial justice sort of spaces. Thousands and thousands of jobs were created that sort of had these sort of noble sounding purposes to pursue racial justice, because these institutions wanted to demonstrate that they cared and they were listening and they were on the right side of history, etc. And so a ton of these activists, it was literally the case very often that someone could be in the streets one week, right, protesting and chanting and rallying, and in the next week they're in one of these jobs. And what they think they're going to do when they get into these jobs is to really shake the system up and change everything. And then they discover that they are a bureaucrat in a nonprofit or a university, both of which are the types of institutions that are ostensibly designed to make change, but which are incredibly skilled at folding that passion into bureaucratic administrivia so that nothing gets done. And that's sort of a microcosm of the whole thing that happened. There's a famous photo of Nancy Pelosi and a bunch of other congressional leaders, and they're draped in kente cloth and they're kneeling on the floor of Congress, you know, in to honor the memory of George Floyd. And this is sort of what happened in general, which is everything got sucked into the symbolic apparatus so that it looked like something was happening, but no tangible change happened. So like if you go on Netflix, I think there's still a section that they added, like the Black Voices section, right? And then you ask yourself, what is the tangible connection between the Black Voices section on Netflix and the material condition of any actually existing Black person's life? It's zero. But that's what happened. And I think that it demonstrates an inability for people to get outside of the symbolic. I think that there's such a fatalism now, a profound fatalism about the inability to make real change, that everybody just hides in symbols and language because they don't feel like they can get anything done anywhere else.
Yeah, now let me get to one other topic, which is the issue of education and your one published book, The Cult of Smart. What would you say the bottom line of that book is in terms of what should we be doing differently? I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Brian Kaplan, we had on last week. Are you familiar with his?
I am. I've read The Case Against Education.
Yeah. So, I mean, his bottom line is just, defund the education in some sense. I guess, you could argue, well, that's money you could spend differently. But anyway, what would be your bottom line?
Yeah. So, look, I would start with the sort of empirical observation that underpins all of this, so that everybody knows where I'm starting from, which is the fact that I would argue is the broadest and most consistent in all of education research is also the most underdiscussed. So a guy like Raj Chetty, who's become an academic superstar by talking about,
the kindergarten teacher.
Right, yeah. By talking about all these ways that we're going to, get these, to me, highly unlikely outcomes in education. The most underdiscussed element is this. To a remarkable degree, the relative placement of students in the academic hierarchy stays consistent over the course of academic life. In other words, if you take a group of students and you look at the beginning of their academic journey, you assess them on a variety of metrics. There will be a hierarchy of ability. You have your top performing kids, you have your bottom performing kids, and you have all your kids in between. To a degree that people really don't understand, those relative positions in the hierarchy are maintained throughout the course of formal schooling. So, for example, data collected after kindergarten gives us good predictive information about which kids are going to graduate from college. Okay? Data gathered at a very early age gives us strong predictive information about where kids end up. Of course, in a big, messy, shaggy human system, there are exceptions. Some kids start out poorly and some life event happens that lets them sort of take hold of their potential and take off. Some kids have some sort of tragic life event and they fall off a cliff. And of course, there's some wiggle up and down. But in general, kids just don't move around in the hierarchy. Okay, like a B- kid tends to be a B- kid in kindergarten, in 4th grade, in 8th grade, in 12th grade, in college. Okay, so 3rd grade reading group, which is a very coarsely gradiated predictor. Usually there's only 3 levels, which they usually call gold, silver, and bronze because they don't want to be insulting, but it means, high, medium, and low. 3rd grade reading group is a very strong predictor of who's going to go to college. Okay, yeah. The kids who were in the high reading group in 3rd grade have a very strong chance of going to college, and the kids in the low reading group have a much lower chance of going to college. Okay, and people really hate this. They really, really, really do not want to hear this because they think that it forecloses on human possibility. but it's just reality. And in fact, some of the research demonstrates, particularly in the language arts, that as students age, as they get older, the correlation between past performance and present performance gets stronger. In other words, as the kids get older, their place in the hierarchy gets more and more and more fixed. To pick another example, 13-year-olds, you give 13-year-olds SAT tests. Not only do those SAT tests tell you how well they're going to do in high school in terms of grades, not only does it tell you that whether they're going to go to college and how well they do in college, those tests give you good predictive information about who will ever get a PhD, who will get tenure at a university, who will ever hold a patent, over who will ever publish a book. Okay, 13-year-olds. The average age at which an American gets a PhD is over 30. So we're talking about like 17-year gap between the prediction and the outcome event, and yet a test given at 13 is that predictive, right? The premise of my book is, let's take this seriously, right? Let's assume that this is an indication that there is some sort of thing as an individual academic tendency or potential. Let's assume that, like, the fact that students so often wind up in the same place, despite immense differences in educational environments. So there are dozens of studies that demonstrate that when students are truly randomly selected into schools of differing perceived quality, it makes no difference to their academic outcome.
Yes, I call that one the null hypothesis, because it just, it just about any educational intervention that people advocate doesn't survive random controlled testing, allowing for fade out, allowing for replication, and so on.
Right. A good example.
So what's the policy implication of this?
Well, the policy implication of this is I think, is a few things. The recognition that different people are good at different things, like the belief that all human beings have something to offer, but that not everyone has the same thing to offer, means that, for example, higher level abstract math requirements are cruel because they force students to attempt to do things that they're not ever going to be able to do. They become a farce because the research indicates that a huge number of students fail it the first time, fail their high-level algebra requirements in high school the first time, and that the second time through, they still don't know how to do it, but the schools feel pressure to socially promote them, right? They don't want that kid to be screwed and to not be able to graduate, right? Andrew Hacker wrote a book called The Math Myth back in 2010, and he pulled numbers that are unbelievable. So, for example, in the year that he looked at in Arizona, 67% of high school students were failing their algebra requirements the first time they took it. 67%, right? Of course.
And now they show up in college. I had a student who I worked through a problem, got 1 minus x equals 0. What's x? And she couldn't do it. And this is a person who's been admitted to college.
Yeah. And so the question is, all right, are we going to continue to use taxpayer dollars, that kid's life, to force them into this pipeline that they don't fit into and they don't want to do? Or do we recognize that different people are good at different things? There's always going to be gifted and talented students who are going to be the ones who become the engineers and the computer scientists and the doctors, et cetera, right? People sometimes say to me, well, aren't you removing the incentive for people to do well academically, to pursue academic excellence? But there's always incentive to pursue academic excellence if you have the skills. But if you look at Germany, for example, Germany has a what's called a soft tracking system, meaning tracking just says, low, medium, high, whatever, you're on the college path or you're on the vocational path, whatever. If the school or the system dictates what track you're on, that's a hard tracking system. If you or your parent get to choose, it's a soft tracking system. In Germany, around age 12 or 13, you will choose to be put onto a vocational path or onto a college path. The system works very, very well for them. It is polls very well in Germany, the system. Students are either getting the sort of the college preparatory, more sort of abstract sort of stuff, but the other students who take the vocational path and get the opportunity to develop jobs-based skills that they then take into the workplace. Now, I do have to say, a caveat about that is that Germany just has a much healthier industrial sector for workers than the United States does. They have very powerful labor unions. There's a lot of sort of unique economic situations in Germany that sort of makes that a more attractive path than it might be for others. But the point is that that system is not understood by German parents to be an insult to the kids who go on the vocational path. It's understood as to offer them another way for students who don't want to take the academic path. And so lower standards where appropriate, have more and different paths and tracks through high school that enable people to take the kind of classes that are actually going to benefit them, offer replacement classes. So again, these algebra requirements so another anecdote, New York State has had the hardest time with its Regents exam, which is this big high school exam. It's a big high school state standardized test. They couldn't get the kids to pass their algebra requirement in the Regents exam. 5 or 6 years ago, there was kind of a big ballyhoo about hey, we got like 76% of New York State students passed their algebra section of the Regents exam. What further investigation revealed was that was because they had lowered the threshold to pass the exam to 33%. In other words, you only had to get 1/3 of the questions right to be considered passing, right? Like that's the reality of these algebra requirements. Why not give students a quantitative reasoning class, right? A sort of statistics for life class, whatever, which involves quantitative reasoning, which involves numbers and thinking through numbers and thinking with the kind of processes that are involved in math, but not the sort of raw abstract calculation that just many kids just can't do.
Okay, so let me open it up. Let me. So Elijah, did you come in with a set of questions, if there were 1 or 2 questions that you wanted to throw out?
So I guess I'll throw out one question just in line with this discussion. In spite of all of the flaws or limitations you highlight to public schooling, you still describe yourself as a fierce defender of public schools. Why is that, or what value do you think schools are providing if they fail to hit a lot of the things that we usually use to evaluate schools?
Well, again, the question of school quality, right? How people define school quality, what they think school quality is a good school is a school that takes kids and molds them up and makes them from being dumb into being smart. Okay. But the whole premise of what I'm talking about is that each of these individual kids has a certain level of academic potential. And that if you look again and again and again at scale, at the level that we're talking about, there just isn't really any reason to believe that institutions can materially move kids from one place to another dramatically in the performance spectrum. It's just we have, formal human education is probably like 12,000 years old, right? We have no known way of taking a bottom quartile kid and making them even a third quartile kid, to say nothing of a top quartile kid. We don't know how to do that, right? So to give you an example of what we're talking about here, the most dramatic intervention I can think of for changing a kid's life would be to adopt them into a home with a significantly different socioeconomic status than the one that they left, right? Well, Eric Turkheimer has done that work. The difference from moving from the lowest to the highest level of socioeconomic status that's available in his research was about 7 points of IQ, or less than 1/2 of a standard deviation. Okay. And that's the most dramatic intervention we can conceive of. And of course, we would neither could scale that nor would we want to, right? So the idea that public schools are low quality, it means like on what metric, right? Like on what vector? Because you know, there's this old saw that liberals say all the time, which is you know, the poorly performing kids can't be in the good schools because of zoning, right? And so they don't get the good education that's in the schools behind the zoning wall. And so that's why they don't do well, right? But of course, the causation is the opposite, right? The schools that we think of as the good schools, we think of them precisely because they screen out the lowest performing students. This is something that private school educators understand. If you talk to people in private schools as often as I have, they would like some limited voucher programs out there because they'd like more money, right? And a bigger customer base. But they're profoundly ambivalent about the idea of a mass voucher system which would flood potentially their schools with the very kind of students that have not been there, right? Because their reputation for excellence depends upon the exclusion of those students, right? What do I care about in a school? I want it to be an environment that is nurturing. If we understand nurturing in a broader context than just can move test scores. I think one of the most sort of sacred and important roles that schools play that people underestimate is, for many of our students out there, our public school students out there, school is the only place where they consistently have heat, where they consistently have hot water, where they can consistently get a meal, where they can consistently know that there isn't going to be an act of parent violence, right? Because you know, for many of these kids, the greatest source of danger in their lives is their parents, right? Like that actual function of providing a place to go to where it's warm and relatively safe and where they have food is, I think, deeply underestimated. And then, yeah, like I don't think that there's any reason to believe that charter schools or private schools are doing any better of a job of nurturing the kind of non-academic skills that I care about, like compassion and creativity and curiosity and breadth of interests, etc.
Okay, anyone else raise a hand either virtually or whatever? Okay, let's have Richard.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about the problem of the homeless or the unhoused.
Mm-hmm.
In Los Angeles, 40 million, I'm sorry, there are 40,000 unhoused, according to some estimates. The population is 4 million. And of these, I understand that about half of the 40,000 have psychiatric abnormality or some type of emotional disturbance. And of the 40,000, about 16% are schizophrenics. And some of those can be treated in some fashion with antipsychotic drugs with greater or lesser success. But there's a larger portion which don't have schizophrenia, don't have psychosis, but have some psychiatric illness. And of these, many have addiction problems. How would you address this issue? But let me comment first about some of the problems associated with this, and that is the issue of being homeless or unhoused. Some people say that the first thing to do is to put them in housing first. That has some advocates, and that may be something to discuss. Another issue, and you've alluded to, is the problem of the healthcare system. Some say if there's universal healthcare, there may be access to care which might facilitate our treatment of these people in their needs. So your thoughts about housing first, your thoughts about some better healthcare system that might be appropriate to meet the needs, those would be of interest to me.
Yeah, so I would just repeat what I have heard from Housing First people on several occasions in the past, which is that the name is Housing First, it's not housing only. So Housing First people will often stress that they do think that housing is the core problem with homelessness and the only reliable solution. But they don't mean to imply that that doesn't mean that other things like psychiatric healthcare aren't important. Right. Look, this country desperately needs zoning and regulatory reform to allow for more building of housing. There's just no question that the degree of difficulty that anyone trying to build a house or an apartment building in this country faces is absurd. And that part I absolutely agree with. We need an end to parking minimums. We need to address this issue of huge tracts of land being designated as historical areas where you can't build, or where you have immense sort of restriction on when you can build. We have to address the NIMBY problem. I agree with all of that, and I think we need a housing abundance agenda very badly, not just for the homelessness problem, but for the fact that, I just felt compelled to buy a house for half of what I was approved for with a mortgage because of, my fear of buying housing that I couldn't ultimately afford because of the problem in our systems are so bad. However, like I said before, people are treatment resistant, right? It's important to say that there are people who are born rich and very privileged who struggle for their entire lives to stay out of the streets or the prisons, etc., because of their mental illness, right? And I think one of my frustrations with this conversation is that so often people seem not willing to sort of grapple with how deep and persistent these problems are. When I was arguing recently for more involuntary commitment, and I had a bunch of my liberal and lefty friends saying, oh, no, how can you say that? How can you say that? What we need to do is we need more funding for various things. But the problem is, of course, I would like more funding for various issues related to this topic. But fundamentally, if someone is facing a mental illness that is deluding them into believing things that are not true, and that is preventing them from understanding what's happening to them, so there's a condition called anosognosia, which is the technical medical term for when you don't understand that you're sick. All of the support services in the world aren't going to help you, right? So it's a very, very common experience for people working in homelessness, the social workers, for example, where, hey, I found you a bed, I found you a program, I found you a job, et cetera, and they just won't take it, right? And that's just a tougher nut to crack. And you mentioned drug addiction. Drug addiction and psychotic disorders are what we call comorbid, right? Like they tend to happen a lot together. I said before that an estimate you see a lot for the percentage of the population with a psychotic disorder is like 1.5%. In the homeless population, it's more like a quarter of them. So it really is an immense problem. As far as a better healthcare system, I would love one. I'm a big lefty, and I would love a sort of a single payer system as they have in many other advanced democracies. But again, it doesn't matter how good access you have if your brain won't let you access it.
So from society's point of view, if a person is non-compliant with the recommendation and they're causing problems for other citizens, what is the solution? Should they be involuntarily confined to some particular humane place so others can be safe and not perturbed?
I mean, the ideal is if they are peacefully brought into a medical facility where they can be evaluated by trained psychiatric personnel, and that psychiatric personnel decides that they're actively psychotic and that they are facing a break from reality that prevents them from understanding where they are and what they're doing, then they should be medicated with antipsychotics, injectable antipsychotics. And the ideal scenario is, and what does happen is, the antipsychotics reduce the level of delusion to the point where the person can apprehend the fact that they're sick and begin the process of recovery. That happens to a lot of people. It doesn't happen to a lot of people also, but a lot of people, once they get back into on medication, they will often have long periods when they stay medicated and in treatment because the medication helps them to understand that they need to be medicated.
That's perhaps a minority. Only 16% in Los Angeles are psychotic, but then there are those with sociopathy or PTSD, separate categories of dysfunction.
Yeah, I wish I knew what to do about them.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Tom, you had your hand up. You're gonna have to.
Yeah, hi, Freddie. I had to unmute. Thanks for coming on. I got your book. I decided to cancel my subscription to your Substack, but then I read, I think in January or February, how many other people you heard from who complained about your Marxism canceling. And I agreed with you once again. So I'm not canceled yet. I wanted to
Well,
ask a
I'll
couple.
comp you next time if you want. Don't worry about it.
Okay, thanks. I'm in Slovakia, by the way, so it's 3 a.m. in the morning.
Oh God.
Well, that's why I'm on the headphones, so they can only hear me. Uh, a little bit personal. I really like you dunking on the liberals, but I also appreciate your honest dunking on conservatives. And I wanted to ask you if you could give a couple of names, 2 or 3 of the conservatives you read most often, and liberals that you read most often.
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of an obvious name, but Ross Douthat, I think, is an extremely thoughtful guy. I feel a little bit bad about picking him because, you know, many people see him as the sort of New York Times's house conservative, so they would question his conservative bona fides or whatever. But he's a very thoughtful person who has been very consistent, and it can't be easy to be, you know, in the position that he's in, given the New York Times' readership. There's Noah Millman is somebody who really sort of defies easy categorization. In some ways, he's certainly a conservative. He was a columnist for the American Conservative for a very long time. But Noah is a guy who was a former Wall Street banker who burned out terribly on it, and is now a filmmaker and has made some interesting things. He's also an observant Jew who has he writes very often about the sort of conflicted and tangled relationship to Israel. So he's definitely someone that I always look forward to reading. And Daniel Larison writes just about exclusively about foreign policy. I've never known him to comment on domestic policy. He, again, is someone who wrote for the American Conservative for a long time and has sort of been identified as a paleo-conservative. But I think that he is the best foreign policy writer in American media right now, and has been for, I don't know, 15 years. He is someone who I think he's bringing again, like a sort of paleocon perspective on foreign policy, but he is the best kind of moralist, in my opinion. His hatred of empire is driven not by sort of Henry Kissinger like realism, but by a profound sense of sort of moral outrage. In terms of liberals that I like to read, I mean, she's a socialist, really. Elizabeth Bruenig, who's now at the Atlantic, is a favorite of mine. Again, of extremely unique perspective, in the sense that she is someone who is a very devout Catholic, and is I'm not going to put words in her mouth and call her pro-life. She has moral objections to abortion. I believe her stance is that she wants it to be legal, even though she has moral objections, but I don't want to put words in her mouth, excuse me. So she's very interesting all the time. I also like the show Breaking Points, which I'm sure you're familiar with Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty. Crystal Ball is a kind of feisty left liberal, maybe I would say. And Sagar and Jetty is a maybe reform conservative is what I would call him. But they have an online show that I like a lot called Breaking Points, which is really good.
Okay, thanks. I think Arnold's on mute.
Are you talking, Arnold? You're on mute.
Sorry, I muted myself because I've been coughing so much. Okay, well, I think we're about at the end of an hour, and I'd like to thank you, Freddie, very much. We had a very attentive audience. no one left. And we'll keep reading you, and I'll put this conversation up on YouTube soon.
Great.
Okay.
How Elites Aid the Social Justice Movement, September 5th, Simon & Schuster. Pre-order now.
Okay, that we'll be very interested in that one. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, Freddie.